Now, the big criticism is that they cause those cycles as well. They're not just so anything has cycles to it. So even without a central bank, cycles do in the modern age. The foundation of what fiat currency is the liability of a central bank. They're the foundational ledger that they currently run on. And they obviously control the size of that ledger. They normally increase it. They can occasionally decrease it. And so that's kind of their first purpose. And then the second purpose is they want to run that own ledger themselves rather than rely on a ledger they can't control, like gold or Bitcoin or something. Because if there's a problem with the amount of debt units in the system, then rather than letting the debt units go down, which can include government bonds, basically instead of letting them default or otherwise have a disorderly thing, they just print more units. And so that's still a key thing, is funding the sovereign. And we saw it, as recently as 2022 during the UK gilt crisis. They had a major problem with their bonds. And the central bank, Bank of England, they had a speech planned about balance sheet reduction, and they literally canceled it and increased their balance sheet to fix the bond market problem. And then, that was a temporary thing. They eventually went to balance sheet reduction after they kind of cleared the leverage out of the system and kind of bailed it out. But the point is they can step in whenever there's disorderly bond issues, and they can kind of choose what is the release valve going to be. If the government's spending too much money, they can let yields go up. They can let kind of the bond vigilantes and supply and demand kind of, flail in the wind for a while. If it becomes too much of an issue, then they can step in and say, well, now we're going to put some of the release valve into the currency itself, because we're going to suppress yields. We're going to, print more base money to buy bonds, whatever they want to do. And so it gives them a lot of flexibility, which I argue is not a good thing. But that is, from their perspective, that is, one of the reasons they exist. And another thing is that they would deny that. So most central bankers, if you ask them, is one of the reasons you exist to fund the sovereign, almost always they would say no. It's an uncouth thing to say. Maybe some retired central bankers tend to be a little bit more flexible with how they say things.
Yeah.
Not all of them, but some of them. So they would deny that. They would go on about how they're trying to run stable monetary policy. They want to make prices gradually more expensive year after year. And that's kind of their purpose. But, behind the scenes, funding the sovereign is one of the apps, like the top 2 or 3 things that they do. Well, before the kind of the modern era, so the post global financial crisis, they weren't necessarily funding the sovereign too much. Basically, after World War II ended, there's this long stretch where we didn't really have a lot of central bank directly funding of the government. Instead, it was more like managing these private sector credit things. Now, the big criticism is that they cause those cycles as well. They're not just so anything has cycles to it. So even without a central bank, cycles do come and go. There's just kind of human herd behavior that happens and momentum shifts and things like that. But then from their perspective, they're trying to kind of be counter-cyclical. They're trying to like stimulate during a downturn and kind of hold things down during a bubble. With the problem that their actions generally lead to the next bubble. So for example, after the dot-com bubble, well, actually in the middle of the dot-com bubble, when long-term capital management had an issue, they provided liquidity into the market. And then in addition, it was the upcoming Y2K issue, which is now 25 years ago, but people were worried about clocks, hitting 99 and going to 0 and causing an issue. So they were worried about outages and stuff. So they front ran liquidity into the market in the late 1990s. And that contributed to the dot-com bubble on the upside, combined with the exuberance of new technology and everything else. So they weren't the only cause, but they just poured some gasoline onto the already raging fire. And then as the recession happened and as the dot-com bubble melted and everything, in something like 2001, they came out and cut interest rates all the way down to 1%. And they inflated a property bubble, which then blew up, 7 years later. And so they end up being more pro-cyclical, I would argue, than counter-cyclical. I think a lot of it is the sacrifice of the long term for the short term, which again they wouldn't agree with. But basically, they're always kind of putting out the current fire. So it's like if there's a recession, it's like the main thing is get out of the recession. If it's too hot, it's like suppress it. And basically, what they're always trying to do is make sure that total credit keeps going up. In my recent talk at the Bitcoin conference, I pointed out that in like 100+ years of history, there's only been 5 down years in the amount of total credit in the US. 4 of them were in the Great Depression. One of them was a 1% drop in 2008, and they just find that completely impossible. So, they just jump in and make sure private credit's always going up, or the combination of private and public credit's always going up. So they're always trying to pull forward stuff from the future. They're always trying to well, don't stop consuming because that's bad for the economy. It's keep consuming. If consumption's too low, keep consuming. It's this kind of treadmill that they're always trying to keep the economy on. They would argue that the net positive that is good, that the economy's faster because they're doing this, even they might have some flaws. Whereas critics, and I'd be more in the critic camp, even though I do try to steelman their argument to make sure I understand it, but the critic camp would be that it's more detrimental than not. And I think it ultimately comes down to most economists don't think that price controls are good. That the market should set prices, and what central banks do is they set the price of credit, and kind of more fundamental, the price of money, but basically the price of credit. And so their decisions, a small group of individuals, has rippling implications for the entire market. And every time they're wrong, that can affect millions of people.
Mm.
It's price control